Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Shattuck Cinemas and 360 Church. Happy Thanksgiving weekend to you. Hope you've had a really great time. I ate dessert twice on Thanksgiving Day, so I'm very proud of myself. Somebody told me that the average person eats 4,400 calories on Thanksgiving Day, and I think I at least doubled that. So I'm feeling very good about that this morning. My mom is here with us again. Good to have her here. Let's give my mom a huge ovation for 360. Yes. All the way from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I grew up. One of the good things about having your mom around, there's a lot of good things about it, but one of them is you get to hear stories about your family that you did not know. Have you had this experience? Well, Thanksgiving and Christmas have a way of bringing that out, and so I learned a new story about my ancestors over this last weekend. My grandfather was a moonshiner. Do you know what that is? Have you seen the Discovery Channel reality show, Moonshiners? This means technically he was involved in the illegal manufacture and transportation of alcoholic beverages. He was a bootlegger at the turn of the 20th century, and this means that he was involved in organized crime. Now, the organization might only be your cousins, but it still involved the threat of arrest and jail time and secrecy. And so what they did was Granddad and his friends and many, many others in their community in the hills of western Maryland would set up illegal stills out in the woods, which would produce grain alcohol, and they would dig out, excavate depressions in the earth underneath big rocks, and they would put the alcohol into jugs and stick it under these rocks and cover it over so that the federal and state agents would not be able to seize it and end their livelihood. Now, he didn't do just this. He also did a little coal mining and other kinds of things, which was the prominent employment in his area. And that today doesn't sound like, such a big deal. I mean, I set up a still with a couple friends in the back of my high school chemistry lab back in the same century. And with the full approval of my chemistry teacher, who I hope is long retired at this point. And I remember Mr. Rostek giving us just one piece of advice when you run an illegal still. And it's this: never drink anything out of it, because there is one molecule's difference between a cocktail and a poison. And so we never touched it, but it was fun. And so hearing these moonshiners, it's not really a terribly big deal if you've got a reality show about it. It's kind of comic entertainment. But in those days, it was pretty deadly serious stuff for him, and for a lot of reasons. And apparently it became so serious at one point that he was converted. He became a Christian. He started to follow Jesus, and he gave up the illegal manufacture and transportation of alcoholic beverages, which isn't the worst thing in the world, but it's not really something you want to write home to your mom about either. He gave it all up, devoted himself to coal mining and to running the literal little general store, which was the only store to shop in the small community he served, and it was right next to the big white clapboard house where my mom and her 11 siblings all grew up. I have personally stood in this store and at that house. After World War I, the demand for coal, which was the lifeblood of the economy of this little community out in the hills, declined sharply, and with it, a regional depression fell on the little town like a hammer blow from above, and employment was just swept away for people almost overnight. Now, this is in an era where there is no government safety net whatsoever. This is even before FDR's New Deal programs in the Great Depression. There's nothing to help people. So there's no money, no jobs, no employment, no prospects. Everybody's unemployed because 2/3 or 3/4 of the city are coal miners, and their lives are just over. Now, I've met these folks. These are proud mountain people, and for as long as they could, they held out by growing vegetables in the backyard, raising chickens, and eating them, and anything else they could do to sort of scratch out an existence in the absence of income and jobs. But when all of that ran out, there was nowhere to turn except the little general store that my grandfather operated in a town so small there are no stop signs. They approached him and asked if they could buy groceries on credit, and he set up an arrangement which was to allow them to buy everything they needed on credit, and then at the end of this regional depression, as they were able, they would pay him back. And to make this arrangement work, my granddad in turn went to his wholesale suppliers and asked them, will you loan me the groceries that I need to give to the people in the city on credit, and when I'm able, I will pay you back. He had such trust with his suppliers that they actually agreed to that in the middle of this regional economic downturn. First year, everything at the store is on credit. Nobody can really pay anything. Second year, same thing. And then finally, as the economy starts to improve, people began to come to the little general store, which was a combination grocery store, post office, sheriff's department, gas station, butcher shop, and feed store, all under one roof. The place is just flat amazing. It was like Walmart ahead of its time. I mean, it was phenomenal. It was the only source of life in the whole city, right across the street from the little church that everybody went to. People began to pay off these debts after about the second year, and what my grandfather did was took the money he got from the people paying off their bills and turned it around and sent all of it to his wholesale suppliers. And when the suppliers had all had their debts retired, and he had cleaned the books with them, he took all of the bills that the people in the town owed him and burned them. He wiped the slate clean, pressed reset on the life of the entire community, and in a very literal way, he saved the town by himself. Now, when Mom told me that, I thought, Mom, where has this story been my whole life? This is unbelievable. This is like some Old Testament narrative, like Joseph saving Egypt from starving, you know. It's just unreal, but it opened up for me a little window on myself and my own attitudes, and I thought maybe a little bit of how I feel about cities, how I care about cities, how I believe in the potential of cities in the world, how I pray for Jesus to reveal himself in this city, how I want to see people have the same kind of life-changing experience that my grandfather had. Maybe some of that has come downhill from him to me. You know, who we come from makes a lot of difference. It is terribly important. In fact, people are so convinced of that, you know, the number one search term on the internet, of course, is pornography. The number two is genealogical research. Ancestry.com has a virtual monopoly on this kind of information, and their research says that there are 84 million people around the world who spend between $1,000 and $18,000 a year just to find out what their heritage actually is. And the median, if we can say that, person who does this is an over 55 white woman whom they call Aunt Betsy. Actually, in our family, we have an Aunt Betsy. It's my wife's oldest sister, Judy. She has taken on the task of being the family genealogist. Listen, pray for this person to show up in your family so you are not saddled with this duty, because it is so much work. I can't believe she does it. She has made multiple trips to Europe at her own expense to be able to find out what the roots of the family are in England. You know, who was a horse thief, who was hanged, who was a king, that kind of thing. Who came over on which ship, where they landed, where they settled, where they went from there, and has done thousands of hours in internet and hard copy library research, pulling together birth certificates, death certificates, and every other kind of document that she can have, diagrams, pictures, websites, archives. It's so much material that she actually mails us about every other month a hard copy newsletter called Prairie Roots, which turns up her latest findings on the history of the family. Now, in the course of this research, Judy has discovered that Janet's great-great-grandfather was part of a church planting team in Thief River Falls, Minnesota. Have you ever been there? Yeah, it's not too big. Thief River Falls, Minnesota. Now, these people were all first-generation Norwegian immigrants, covered wagon people, prairie people. And what they did in those days is her great-grandfather, Halmer, and his friends, the Norwegians and others, they were Lutherans, they would form and organize a congregation first, then they would build a building, and then once they had that all together, they would go out and find a pastor to lead the thing. Nobody showed up in a community and tried to put together a team the way we did here. It was the complete opposite. And he was involved in this, and the church has a website and still exists to this day. And it gave me a little window on my wife. I thought maybe with her rugged prairie pioneering mentality, this is what Janet is doing with me in Berkeley. Maybe starting up churches runs in families, and that's part of her heritage, which has run downhill from the people from whence she has come. Where we've come from is a really super big deal. Now this month our series of talks is called Four Christmases for two reasons. One is I think the Vince Vaughn movie is funny. And the other reason is, handily, we've got 4 Sundays and there are 4 gospel writers. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. What a deal! Each Sunday we're going to have an opportunity to get a different and fresh perspective on who Jesus is and what his arrival in the world that we're celebrating at this time of year has to do with our lives and why that's important. And we're going to begin with Matthew's account of Jesus coming among us, what we call the incarnation. And his account is an unusual one because it opens with a genealogy. 17 verses of genealogy. And when I looked at this, I thought, really? An introduction that's a genealogy? I mean, that's so boring. I mean, why would you start with a long list of names? I mean, it's as boring as, well, like reading a Bible genealogy. It's just, why would you do that? But Matthew's genealogy, which you find in the first 17 verses of his gospel, is an amazing document. And it begins with this verse: the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David and the son of Abraham. Then there are 41 generations between Abraham and Jesus. Let's skip to verse 17. So all of the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations. In other words, Abraham to David, that's about 2000 BC to about 1000 BC. He records 14 generations in that time span. He goes on in verse 17, and from David to the deportation to Babylon, about 14 generations. David dates, as I said, about 1000 BC. Israel's carried off into exile in Babylon or Iraq about 600 BC. So now we've shortened the interval. There's still 14 generations. And from the deportation to Babylon to Christ, 14 generations. Now we're down to 600 BC until the BCs run out and Jesus is born. Some scholars believe that Matthew chose 14 generations as it's a mnemonic, it's a memory device, or because the mathematics of that fits the mathematics of the name of David in the Hebrew language, probably also kind of a memory device. But regardless of his reasoning for the 14, the genealogy is really a paradox because it is both very, very open and very, very specific at the same time. It's like the double helix of DNA. It has these two very opposite kind of traits. And you see the openness right away in the fact that there's so much white space involved in his listing of names. Ancient cultures did not regard genealogies in this kind of form as literally listing every single person that was in the family tree for simple logistical reasons. It would have taken the entire book, in fact the entire Bible, to fill up with all of the people who were ever involved in the lineage of Christ. Even the Old Testament regards genealogies as selective presentations of who is in the ancestry of the person being named, or who is the descendant of the person being named. In one place in Exodus, we're told there were 4 genealogical links between a man named Levi and Moses, but Levi actually has 22,000 descendants. So obviously there's just a little bit of editing there. And so what happens in the ancient world is when you're presenting a genealogy, you present it selectively in this, as if you were going to tinyurl.com. You ever use that? You take a massive URL and you shrink it to just 26 characters. It does exactly the same kind of a thing by telling, okay, here's the beginning and here's the end. We didn't include really all of the middle, but you get the general drift of it. And so it's really like a scrapbook of people from the past designed to give you a kind of an overall impression. And from that impression, then, what Matthew wants us to arrive at is the conclusion that, yes, Jesus is the son of David, the son of Abraham. He wants us to arrive at the conclusion that he's the Messiah. And in the first century Jewish culture of Palestine, to which he's writing, this concept of genealogy is hugely important, because if Jesus can't be traced back to David and Abraham, then nothing else in the book of Matthew matters. Not the miracles, not the healings, not the preachings, not the Sermon on the Mount, nothing, because if he's not the one, it's just another book. And yet he presents this with so much white space in it. I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable. Listen to the people who were involved in the lineage of Jesus. Abraham, who gave his wife away to other men twice. Isaac, who favored Esau over Jacob. Jacob, who deceived Isaac to steal his brother's birthright. Judah and his brothers. Remember them? They sold their brother Joseph into slavery. Tamar, who pretended to be a prostitute and committed adultery. Hezron and Ram, we know nothing about them. They're not remarkable enough to merit any historical mention. Abinadab, Aaron's father-in-law. Nahshon, who was a military commander during the Exodus. Salmon, who may have been a spy. Rahab, who was a prostitute. Ruth, who was a Gentile woman from Moab. Jesse, who overlooked David as candidate for king of Israel. And David the king, liar, adulterer, murderer, and musician. Then in that second section of David to the exile, King Solomon, 700 wives, 300 concubines, idolater. Bathsheba, David's victim and palace plotter. Rehoboam, who split the kingdom with ruinous taxes. Abijah, who fought a civil war. Asaph, he might have been a musician. Jehoshaphat, a good king who went bad. Joram, we know nothing about him either. Doesn't merit any mention. Uzziah, a king who was struck by leprosy because he disobeyed God. Jotham, a good king who was deposed by his son. Ahaz, who deposed his father to become an evil king. And then Hezekiah, the best king ever. Manasseh, who's an idolater and reversed all of Hezekiah's religious reforms. Ammon, who was just as bad as his dad until he was assassinated. Josiah was a good king who restored worship of God. And Jeconiah, the last king before the deportation, he was carried off to Babylon to live there in exile. And in the last set of 14 generations, we have Shealtiel, who was the king of the people of Israel in exile. Zerubbabel, who led them back and restored the temple. And then in that last section of 14 generations, we have 9 people who were so completely ordinary, so utterly unremarkable, that we don't know anything about them. Wouldn't that just make you proud? I mean, look at the great descent of the Son of God, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Why, he's preceded by a raft of nobodies. And then there's Joseph, the husband of Mary, who gives birth to Jesus, the one who is called the Christ. Nice family, huh? Liars, cheaters, warmongers, power grabbers, murderers, idolaters, adulterers, and plain old ordinary people outnumber the heroes probably 10 to 1. Now that's what I would call a wide open family heritage. Typically in the ancient world, if you were going to establish the credentials of someone, you would simply list the heroic people who preceded them. You would skip everybody else. You know, if Uncle Ned never quite got a job, but Aunt Nellie saved the life of the king, she would make the list and he would be on the cutting room floor. But Matthew is brutally honest. If these are ordinary people, he says so. If they were involved in all kinds of skullduggery, he lists them anyway, because all of it goes into the heritage of the person who will become the Savior of the world. It's a wide open list. Specifically, it includes women. 5 of them. This is not done. For one thing, customarily, genealogies only included men. So you would locate yourself by your country, your state, your county, your city, and then your street address. A person in the ancient world locates themselves by their nation, their tribe, their clan, and their father. Because to be a woman in the ancient world is to be furniture. You are property. And what happens in your life is dictated either by a husband or by a father and no one else. You are an object. You are a thing. And so when Matthew includes 5 women in the genealogy, he's insinuating, without saying it directly, that there is a revolution coming. That something completely different, something that no one has ever seen before, is about to happen. And not only does he include women, he includes 4 Gentile women. Tamar is a Canaanite. Ruth is a Moabite. Do you know the people of Moab were explicitly forbidden in the Old Testament from being involved with Israel in any way? Even Bathsheba, who is dragged into David's palace, is married to Uriah. He's a Hittite. She's married to a Gentile. It's just a complete mess. Rahab is from Jericho. She's not only a Gentile, she's a prostitute. And so the notion of a genealogy to protect the ethnic purity of the nation is suddenly turned over. And with it, the implications that since we've got Gentile women, we've got interracial marriage. Now we're way over the line. Something crazy is coming. Something radical. Something is about to turn over everybody's apple cart and put the world in an entirely new place. What could that something be? When I look at this genealogy, the word that comes to my mind is porous. There are holes in it. There's white space in it. And by that, what I mean is there's sort of room for everybody. You know? It doesn't matter what your gender is. It doesn't matter what you've been involved in the past. It doesn't matter about your race. It doesn't matter. It's just the whole world is included here. There is room for everybody in the ancestry of Jesus. It's very, very open. But at the same time, it's very, very specific. Matthew says in verse number 1 that Jesus is both the son of David and the son of Abraham. This is crucially important to his audience because for a person to qualify as the Messiah, they have to meet both of those genealogical criteria. Now, there are other things too, but without these two things, these are the bare minimums, these are the two rails that his identity and his ministry to the world run on, and they are the rails that will take him to the cross because of that claim. Being the son of David was crucially important because it located him not just within the Jewish nation, but within the tribe of Judah from which the Messiah was going to spring. Throughout Matthew, Jesus is identified as David's son, and this puts him in the sweet spot of the covenant that God made with King David, which was simply to say that someone from your family is always going to rule and reign over the nation from your throne. Even if they're not present, they will always have the right to do so. And so Jesus inherits this kingly position from King David, his forefather. I always think about the blind men sitting beside the road who desperately want their eyes to be open. Recorded by Matthew that as Jesus passes by, somehow they sense that he's going by, maybe hearing the crowd talking about it, and seated beside the road with people between themselves and Jesus as he's traveling by, they cry out, "Son of David, have mercy on us." The common people applied this title to Jesus because when they did so, they expressed their hope that he was the one who embodied everything that would change when Messiah arrived, when the anointed one of God was here, when the Son of God was revealed in history, and they simply cried out to him. You see, people who are in desperate need like that, they can't fool around with theological niceties and the details and all the embroidery and the footnotes and the codicils and the lawyers and your people and so forth. They just need help right now, and they know help when they see it, and when they saw it, they called him Son of David. And he opened their eyes. This claim was so well established that even ancient opponents of Christianity never brought a rebuttal against it. Not one time. Matthew also identifies him as the son of Abraham, which means that Jesus is right in the sweet spot of the covenant that God made with that historical figure, the founder of the nation that would become the Jewish people. Did you know that the first Jew was a Gentile? Yeah, Abraham was a Gentile when God found him, and through him creates this nation. And God's promise to Abraham was, look, I'm going to give you a place to live. I'm going to give you so many descendants that they will number like the stars in the heavens or the sand on the sea. And through the way I'm going to bless you, I'm going to bless the entire world. And so by calling Jesus this son of Abraham, Matthew's saying that he is the one through whom God's blessing is going to be extended to the entire world. And while Jesus has no biological descendants, the Da Vinci Code is wrong, by the way. He has no biological descendants. He has spiritual descendants who do number as many as the stars in the heavens. In the 8th chapter of John, he said this to his religious opponents. He said, "Your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad." Abraham was looking forward to the coming of Christ. So the Jews said to him, "You're not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham?" And Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." So they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. To receive the promise of this covenant that God made with Abraham is to identify himself as the Son of God and the Savior of the world. The one who will ironically bring down every barrier. The one who will bring down barriers between Jews and Gentiles. The one who will bring down barriers between men and women. The one who will bring down barriers between nation and nation. The one who will bring down barriers between religious people and not very religious people. The one who will bring down the ultimate barrier, which is the barrier between God and people, by riding those two rails to the cross, where he will die for the sin of the world. A sin which he does not assume just at that moment when he's nailed to the cross, but a sin which has been part of his genealogical background through every family out of whom he comes. Jesus comes into the world not on a flaming chariot with an army of angelic hosts gleaming like the stars. He doesn't come into the world rolling up in a lime green Bentley surrounded by his peeps with a manager and an accountant and a personal trainer and paparazzi. He doesn't roll into the world wearing sunglasses so he can remain incognito as he slips in and out of different public buildings. But he arrives like a little baby, like a little nobody in a manger in Bethlehem, and he is the product of all of these generations of people who were good and bad and nothing, who have handed him off to the world and said, here he is. What he represents is so open that anybody who wants a share of it by faith can be involved. It doesn't matter what your starting point is. But what he is so specific that only he offers that hope. There are no other sources of hope, just him. And together, those two things become the Word made flesh. You know, when I was a boy growing up in the city of Pittsburgh, I used to love to see the rivers that define the shape of the city. We had two of them that came in from the east and flowed together. The Monongahela River and the Allegheny River. Very big, very deep, very fast. And where they flowed together, they formed a triangle of land, and that triangle defined the downtown area. In fact, it's called that, and the stadium where the sports teams play is there, and all of the business enterprises of the city are basically located there. And the valleys around those rivers, everything that makes Pittsburgh whatever it is all scattered across those valleys. And I grew up just a few miles from where that triangle of land was located. And I have always loved when I visit there to come in from the airport at night, and you come out of the Fort Pitt Tunnel, and just as you emerge from it, you see all of the lights of the bridges and that downtown triangle area turned on, and it's like a constellation. And you just go, man, it's a great place to live. And then I remember what used to line those rivers. Steel mills, chemical plants, sewage plants, when I grew up there. Up and down, because that fast-flowing cold water made a really handy way of carrying garbage to where someone else lived. And that was the theory in those days. And so as the Monongahela and the Allegheny would flow together, and the toxic waste would be dumped in, and the leftovers from steel production and everything else from producing paint and all of the effluent from sewage treatment were all poured together, these two streams of toxic water would then flow together to form one much larger stream of toxic water called the Ohio River, which would then rush toward the Mississippi, ultimately with the goal of carrying all of our leftover junk somewhere down past New Orleans and out into the Gulf of Mexico, which is, I suppose, where it all ended up. And so these two sewers came together to make this one bigger sewer, which went to the Mississippi. I was thinking about this week, and I thought this must have been what it felt like to Jesus to come from this line of people. It's like all of this crud flows downhill, murdering and lying. Believe me, none of the 10 commandments, none of them survive this family tree. They are all gone by the time we end up at Bethlehem. All of this crud flows downhill, downhill, downhill through the tributaries of these many lives, and it all arrives with him, and all the poison comes together. And that's why he's the only one that can do anything about that. And that's what he takes to the cross. And that's what he dies for in my place and your place. And that's why in him there's forgiveness and reconciliation for every kind of poison that the human race can concoct, because every single form of it arrived in him through these genealogical tributaries. He puts them all to death on the cross. He nails them to the tree. And through faith in him, no matter where you've come from or what you've been involved in or how your conscience may plague you or what barriers or walls you're facing in your life, in him, he can take that all away. He can cleanse us so that we're like it never happened. Not parole, not probation, pardon. He can restore us, he can rebuild us, and through him, you get to start a new family line. Lord, we thank you for your great love toward us this morning. We're so grateful that in all the many ways that we've strayed or ways that we've been confused or all the strange things that sometimes happen to us, that through all of that and the craziness of life, you've just reached out and found us. God, we thank you for this plan of yours to send your son to do something about all that stuff, to take all the toxin, all the poison, all the brokenness, all the hurt, and to create a remedy for that in his death on the cross. Lord, we thank you. We're so grateful. We ask you today that by your Holy Spirit, our hearts would just reach out to you to receive the fullness of this, to see Jesus in the fullness of who he is, and to just pull him into our hearts by faith, leaving aside everything else, but to find hope in him. We thank you for that and for the kind of love that makes it possible. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.